It was a cool autumn afternoon, and the Hudson River shimmered with the hues of orange and gold as the sun slowly began its descent behind the mountains. Dylan, a lanky 13-year-old, had been fishing by the edge of the river, his favorite pastime. His mother, Lisa, had always said he was a quiet child, content in his solitude. But Dylan preferred it that way. There was something comforting about the rhythmic cast and reel, the pull of the line in the water, the peacefulness of the river's flow. He liked to think of himself as part of this tranquil world, blending into its natural pulse. But that afternoon, everything changed in a way he could never have expected. Dylan had just thrown his line into the water and was waiting for the slight tug of a fish when a distant noise caught his attention. It was a low hum, the sound of an engine growing louder and louder until a sleek, black SUV pulled up on the bridge above. Dylan's heart skipped a beat as he instinctively ducked into the bushes that lined the riverbank. He didn't know why he did it, but the sudden urge to hide, to stay out of sight, felt primal, as though some instinct deep within him was warning him of danger. The SUV came to a stop at the edge of the bridge. Two figures climbed out, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other shorter but just as imposing. They spoke for a moment, their words carried by the wind, too muffled for Dylan to make out. But the tension in their voices was undeniable. His breath caught when the taller figure turned, and Dylan saw the flash of something in his hand, something sharp. Then, the unimaginable happened. The man who had been standing by the side of the bridge, an older figure with graying hair and a tired face, suddenly found himself shoved forward. Dylan gasped as the figure tumbled over the railing and disappeared from view, falling into the river below with a sickening splash. The bushes shook as Dylan's heart raced, his stomach tightening with fear and disbelief. His mind was in chaos. What had just happened? Why had they thrown him? Dylan had no time to process it. His body was already moving before he could fully understand the situation. Without a second thought, he scrambled down the steep riverbank, barely noticing the sharp rocks cutting into his palms as he gripped the uneven ground. The river was cold, colder than usual, as if it sensed the gravity of the moment. Dylan could see the man struggling, barely conscious in the water. The elderly figure's face was pale, his body limp, and there was a dark streak of blood drifting in the current around him. Dylan knew he had to act fast. Without hesitation, he plunged into the water, its icy grip shocking his system. He fought against the current, swimming as hard as he could toward the unconscious man. Each stroke felt like it took everything out of him, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But he couldn't stop. Not when someone's life was at stake. Not when he was the only one who could help. The moment Dylan reached the man, he grabbed hold of him, pulling his limp body toward the shore with all his remaining strength. It felt impossible. How could someone so heavy be saved alone? But Dylan's determination fueled him. And somehow, through sheer willpower, he managed to drag the man to the river's edge. He collapsed beside him, panting for breath, his chest heaving from exhaustion. The man's face was pale, his breathing shallow. Dylan's mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. He had no phone, no way to contact help. The nearest hospital was far, and the man needed immediate care. But then something inside him clicked. There was one person who could help. His mother. She was a nurse, trained to deal with emergencies. She could save this man. With a sense of urgency, Dylan hoisted the man onto his back, barely able to hold him up as he began the long walk back to his house. His legs wobbled with fatigue, but he kept going, step by step, each one carrying him closer to the warmth and safety of home. When Dylan finally reached the house, he was nearly collapsing under the weight of the man. But there was no time to stop. His mother, Lisa, was inside, preparing dinner, unaware of the danger her son was bringing into their home. Dylan kicked open the door and staggered inside, his voice frantic. "Mom, you've got to help. Someone's hurt." Lisa turned, startled, her eyes widening as she saw the blooded man in Dylan's arms. Without a moment's hesitation, she rushed to his side, her nursing instincts kicking in. She checked for a pulse, her fingers trembling as she gently touched his neck. He was still alive, but just barely. "Who is this?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know, but we've got to help him," Dylan said, his voice full of urgency. He was thrown off the bridge. Lisa's eyes darkened as she took in the scene, her professional training kicking into high gear. "All right. We need to get him on the couch. Now. Dylan. Go grab some clean towels and water. We need to stop the bleeding." Dylan nodded quickly, his mind still racing with the fear of what he had just witnessed. The image of the man being thrown off the bridge was burned into his mind. Who would do such a thing? And why? As his mother worked swiftly, assessing the injuries, Dylan's mind couldn't help but wonder, what had he gotten himself into? And then, as Lisa carefully examined the man's features, she froze. "I think I know who this is," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is Edward Sterling. He's a billionaire philanthropist. He's been missing for days." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. The news had been full of reports about Sterling's disappearance. They had been looking for him everywhere. And now, here he was, in their home, gravely injured. Lisa looked up at Dylan, her eyes filled with concern. "This is serious. Dylan. Whoever did this is going to come looking for him. We need to be careful." But Dylan, still processing the magnitude of the situation, only felt one thing: the weight of responsibility. He had witnessed something horrific. But he had also made a choice. He had saved this man's life. And now he would do whatever it took to help him. The hours passed in a blur. Lisa worked tirelessly, patching up the wounds and stabilizing Edward Sterling. Though his condition remained precarious, his body was battered, bruised, and battered by the fall. And the deep gashes on his forehead and arms told the story of someone who had fought desperately before being cast aside like trash. Dylan sat by the fire, watching his mother work, his mind racing with questions that refused to settle. Who could do such a thing? And why did it feel like their lives were now tied to this man's fate? Edward's breathing had steadied, and his pulse was no longer erratic. But he was still unconscious. Lisa had given him painkillers and covered him with a blanket, her clinical demeanor masking the anxiety that lingered beneath the surface. As she worked, she muttered quietly to herself, as though calculating every move, ensuring every decision was precise and correct. She was the rock, steady and calm, but Dylan could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the bandages. After a while, Edward stirred. A quiet groan escaped his lips, and his eyelids fluttered open. Dylan froze, his heart leaping into his throat as he watched the elderly man slowly regain consciousness. Edward's eyes were unfocused at first, his pupils dilated and his mind still trapped in the fog of pain. Lisa was by his side in an instant, her voice soothing and low as she gently spoke to him. "Mr. Sterling, can you hear me? You're safe now." Edward's eyes flickered toward her, a faint recognition crossing his features. But it was clear that the man was disoriented. He tried to sit up, his movements slow and uncoordinated, but the pain seemed to overwhelm him. Dylan felt a rush of sympathy for the man, but also an unspoken fear. What if Edward couldn't remember who had done this to him? What if his memory was fractured beyond repair? "Where am I?" Edward asked, his voice raspy, barely a whisper. "You're at my house," Lisa replied softly, her hands gently guiding him back onto the couch. "You've been hurt, but you're going to be all right." Edward's eyes searched her face, trying to piece together the situation. But it wasn't until he looked at Dylan that a flicker of recognition seemed to ignite. "Dylan, the boy who saved me," Edward murmured, his voice breaking with gratitude. "Thank you." Dylan nodded, unable to find the words. He felt strangely overwhelmed by the gratitude in Edward's eyes, as though he had been pulled into something much larger than himself. But before he could say anything, Edward's face contorted in pain, and his hand shot up to his temple as though to steady himself. "I remember," Edward said, his voice tightening with frustration. "I remember it all. The betrayal, my son-in-law." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of something terrible. Dylan felt a shiver run down his spine, the ominous tone of Edward's voice sending a ripple of unease through him. "Who did this to you?" Lisa asked, her professional instinct kicking in. She leaned in closer, her gaze sharp and focused. Edward closed his eyes, his brow furrowing in concentration, as though every recollection caused him physical pain. "Brandon," he whispered, the name escaping his lips like a curse. "Brandon Sterling. My son-in-law, he betrayed me." Dylan's mind raced. The name sounded familiar, he had heard it on the news. Brandon Sterling was a well-known businessman, married to Edward's daughter, a wealthy family with ties to powerful connections. But why would someone like him, someone with everything, betray his father-in-law? Edward's voice grew weaker, but he continued. "He was stealing from me, siphoning off millions of dollars from my accounts. I confronted him. But he paused. The words caught in his throat. "He attacked me. He overpowered me. I never thought he'd go this far." Dylan's stomach twisted as he realized the full scope of what had happened. Brandon Sterling, a man with influence and wealth, had tried to kill his own father-in-law simply to protect his crimes. The man's betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal, too. He had attempted to end Edward's life in the most brutal way possible. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Lisa asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Why did you let him get away with it?" Edward's gaze was distant, his mind clearly weighed down by the choices he had made. "I can't," he muttered, shaking his head slowly. "Brandon has too many connections. He's powerful. If I go to the police, he'll use his influence to destroy me. And worse, he'll hurt my daughter. He's already shown what he's capable of. I need evidence. Concrete proof of what he's done before I can expose him." Dylan felt the room grow heavy with silence as Lisa and he processed the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about a betrayal or a family conflict, it was about survival. And now, they were involved in something dangerous. Caught in the middle of a powerful man's desperate attempt to protect his family from an even more dangerous threat. Lisa exchanged a glance with Dylan, her eyes clouded with worry. She was a mother first, a nurse second. But now she was a protector, and she could feel the weight of this decision pressing down on her. How could she keep her family safe when they were caught up in a mess like this? She could help Edward. But at what cost? Would this decision change everything? As Edward's eyelids fluttered closed again, exhausted from his ordeal, Lisa turned to Dylan. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her voice resolute. "We need to be careful," she said quietly, a note of concern in her tone. "We're in this together now. But we have to be smart. Whoever tried to kill him won't stop until they know for sure he's gone." The days that followed felt like an unspoken countdown, each passing hour bringing more tension, more weight to the heavy air around them. Dylan couldn't stop thinking about the moment when Edward had revealed the identity of his attacker. Brandon Sterling. The name was like a dark cloud that hung over everything now. The more Dylan tried to focus on normal life, the more he felt the gravity of the situation pulling him back into the storm. Lisa had set up a temporary makeshift clinic in their living room, constantly attending to Edward's injuries. His body was healing, but the physical scars were nothing compared to the mental toll it had taken on him. He was exhausted, drained by the pain and the memory of the betrayal. But despite the agony he was in, there was something fierce about his resolve. Edward had refused to go to the police, he couldn't trust them. Not when Brandon's connections might sway the investigation, leaving him vulnerable. It was a frustrating decision for Lisa. As a nurse, she knew the risks of going without official help. But as a mother, she understood Edward's fear. The world he was trying to protect was a delicate one. And going public might have been the final straw. The more time passed, the clearer it became that Edward's safety and that of her family was at risk. "Mom, are we just going to wait around for him to come after us?" Dylan asked one evening, his voice tense with the unease that had been building inside him for days. He was trying to remain calm, but the feeling of impending danger was inescapable. Lisa looked at her son with concern. She could see the restlessness in his eyes, the same uncertainty that had settled deep within her own chest. She had always tried to protect him, shield him from the harsh realities of the world. But now, she wasn't sure if they could avoid the storm that was headed their way. "We're going to have to be patient, Dylan," she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of something else beneath it, an unspoken fear. "Edward has a plan. He's going to retrieve the evidence he needs. And then we can go to the authorities. But until then, we need to stay low. We can't afford to make any mistakes." Dylan nodded, his lips tight. He understood. But that didn't mean he liked it. The waiting game was unbearable. And his mind kept returning to the unanswered questions. Would they be able to get the evidence they needed before Brandon's men found them? Could they stay hidden long enough? The tension in the house was palpable. And as the days wore on, it seemed to grow thicker. Edward remained locked away in a back room, recovering slowly, but his mind was always at work. He was determined to bring Brandon down, but that meant taking a dangerous risk. He needed to return to his mansion, retrieve the damning documents, and then disappear. But that was no simple task. "I'll do it," Edward said one evening, as Lisa and Dylan sat together at the table. His voice was firm, but there was a shadow in his eyes. "I'll go back. I need to get the files. The proof of what Brandon's done." Lisa opened her mouth to protest, but Edward raised a hand to stop her. "No, Lisa. This is my fight. I can't keep running from it." Dylan watched the exchange, feeling the weight of his own thoughts. He wanted to help, he always did, but the stakes were too high. He couldn't just sit idly by while his mother and Edward put themselves in harm's way. But what could he do? What could any of them do in the face of such a powerful enemy? "You can't do this alone," Dylan said, his voice quiet but determined. "I'm coming with you." Lisa shot him a sharp look. But Dylan wasn't deterred. He had seen the fear in his mother's eyes when she'd looked at Edward. The worry that tightened her features when she thought about what would happen when they finally made their move. He wasn't going to sit back and wait for something terrible to happen. He had to do something. "Dylan, this isn't your fight," Lisa said, her voice thick with concern. "You're too young to understand what we're up against." But Dylan met her gaze with the kind of quiet resolve that made her pause. He was her son, and she knew him well enough to understand that once he made up his mind, there was no changing it. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were slipping out of control. She needed to protect him. "I can help," Dylan said, his voice low but steady. "I'm not afraid. We can't let Brandon win. We can't let him get away with it." Edward, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. His voice was hoarse, but there was something in his eyes, something Dylan hadn't seen before. It was respect. "If you're sure, then you're welcome to help. But we need to be careful. It's not just about getting the evidence. It's about surviving long enough to use it." The words hung in the air, a reminder of the dangers they faced. Brandon's influence, his connections, everything about him was a threat that loomed over them. But Dylan wasn't afraid. He had seen his mother work miracles with her knowledge, her determination. And he knew that, with Edward's plan, they stood a chance. The next day, they began preparing for the inevitable. They would make their move. Edward's mansion was a fortress, heavily guarded and surrounded by private security. Getting in without being detected was going to be the real challenge. But in their eyes, there was a glimmer of something else. A fierce hope, a determination to see this through. The stakes had never been higher. but they would fight for what was right. Together. The morning came with a new sense of urgency. Lisa had barely slept, her thoughts constantly circling around the dangers they were about to face. Edward had made it clear that his mansion was the key to their survival. If they didn't retrieve the evidence, everything they had done so far would be in vain. But even more pressing than that was the growing realization that Brandon's men would stop at nothing to find him. The tension in the house was thick, suffocating almost. It was no longer just about saving Edward, it was about ensuring that her son, Dylan, would stay safe. Dylan, however, was unwavering. The idea of being sidelined didn't sit well with him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he had to be a part of the mission. It wasn't just about protecting Edward anymore. It was about protecting his family, too. He had seen how fragile everything had become in the wake of the attack. There were forces out there that could break them if they weren't careful. But there was something else. A deeper pull to the situation that he couldn't explain. It was as if the events had reached into him. And no matter how afraid he was, he knew that he couldn't run from it. Despite his mother's protests, Dylan spent the morning quietly helping Edward gather what he needed. They weren't going to storm the mansion unprepared. Edward, although weak and still recovering, was meticulously planning the next steps, explaining his idea of a covert operation to retrieve the documents he needed. The plan was risky, there was no other way to describe it. But at this point, there were no safer options. Dylan, I'm serious about this, Lisa said, pulling him aside as he gathered some clothes and supplies. This is going to get dangerous. I need you to promise me you'll stay back if things get out of hand. I'm coming with you, Mom, Dylan said, his voice low but firm. You can't protect me from everything. I want to help. Lisa looked at him, her face torn. She wanted to shield him from the dangers, wanted him to stay innocent and untouched by the darkness that was closing in around them. But the truth was, this wasn't just about protecting him anymore, it was about survival. I know, sweetheart, Lisa whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I just want you to be safe. As the day wore on, the house seemed to grow quieter, the sense of looming danger thickening with every passing moment. Lisa had contacted her brother, Mark, a retired detective who had worked for years in a high-stakes environment. She explained everything that had happened: Edward's injuries, the betrayal, the danger they were now facing. Mark had agreed to help, though he had cautioned them to move quickly. They needed to get the documents before Brandon realized his father-in-law had survived. You stay here with Dylan, Mark had told Lisa over the phone. I'll take care of the retrieval. I'll make sure he's safe. Lisa didn't argue, though her gut twisted at the thought of leaving him behind. Mark was resourceful, but this wasn't a simple investigation. There were people out there who could track them down at any moment. It wasn't until that afternoon when things began to take a sharp turn. Dylan, feeling increasingly restless, stepped outside for some fresh air. As he walked to the edge of their property, something caught his eye: a figure in a black car parked down the road. The windows were tinted, but there was something too still about the vehicle. Too deliberate. It didn't take long for Dylan's pulse to quicken. He wasn't sure who it was, but his gut told him they were watching. Before he could process it, the car slowly pulled away and turned down the street. Dylan's heart raced. He wasn't sure if it was one of Brandon's men or just a random passerby, but his instincts screamed that they had been spotted. He quickly rushed back to the house, finding his mother inside, on the phone with Mark. Mom, I saw a car, Dylan said, trying to keep his voice steady, but he could feel the dread creeping in. I think they're following us. Lisa's face immediately hardened. She looked over at Edward, who was seated on the couch, looking weaker than before, but still alive. Get inside, Dylan. Now. Mark's voice came through the phone with an edge of concern. What's going on? Someone's been watching us, Lisa replied, her eyes scanning the windows. We need to move quickly. It's only a matter of time before they realize where we are. Dylan's stomach twisted. He had seen the car, it wasn't just a coincidence. Someone was close. And whoever they weren't going to stop until they found Edward. This wasn't just a threat to him or his mother, it was a threat to their entire lives. They couldn't afford to make any more mistakes. "We need to hurry," Dylan said. His voice suddenly clearer. More determined. "Edward can't stay here. We have to get him out." Lisa hesitated. Then nodded. She knew it was only a matter of time before Brandon's men would make their move. They were running out of time. And now, the stakes had grown even higher. "All right," she said, her voice hardening. "We'll get him to safety. But we can't do it alone. Mark needs to be here now. He'll know how to get Edward to his mansion without being detected." Dylan nodded, knowing what he had to do. But fear still gnawed at him. What would happen if they weren't fast enough? What if Brandon's men already knew their every move? "We can't wait much longer," he said, his words heavy with the realization that danger was now at their doorstep. And, sure enough, they could feel it, the storm was closing in. The air inside the house grew heavy with anticipation. The moments stretched, slow and taut, as Lisa, Dylan, and Edward huddled in the kitchen, awaiting Mark's arrival. Dylan's thoughts raced, his nerves fraying at the edges. Every noise seemed amplified, footsteps on the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the creak of the old wooden door when it was opened. They had no time to waste. Brandon's men were getting closer, and it was only a matter of time before they realized Edward was still alive and hiding in the house. Lisa paced nervously, her hands tightly clutching the phone as she waited for a call back from her brother. Each time it rang, her heart leaped into her throat, hoping it was Mark with news or instructions. But the minutes dragged by, and the silence in the house became unbearable. Dylan couldn't stay still either. He kept glancing at Edward, who was seated at the table, looking frailer than before. The old man had insisted on being part of the plan. Despite his injuries, Edward had a stubborn streak, a quality that had kept him going through the worst of times. But Dylan could see the toll it was taking on him. His breathing was shallow, and his eyes looked tired. It was clear that the physical recovery was only half the battle. The mental strain of his situation weighed just as heavily on him. "I don't like this," Dylan said finally, breaking the silence. "I can't just sit here and wait. We need to do something." Lisa turned to him, her face strained. "We're doing everything we can, Dylan. We have to trust Mark." "But what if it's too late?" Dylan pressed. "What if they're already here?" At that moment, the sharp sound of a car engine roaring down the street broke through the quiet. Dylan's heart skipped a beat. He dashed to the window, his eyes scanning the road. The black SUV he had seen earlier was now parked just a few houses down, its tinted windows hiding whoever was inside. The sight of it made his blood run cold. "They're here," Dylan whispered, his voice tight with fear. Lisa quickly crossed the room, grabbing Edward's arm and helping him to his feet. "Get back to the back room now," she said urgently. "We need to move quickly." Edward nodded, his face pale but determined. "They'll come for me," he murmured, his voice raw. "But I won't let them win." Dylan's mind raced. They couldn't let the men find them. The stakes were higher than ever. And now, there was no turning back. His thoughts flickered to the plan they had made. Mark had suggested recording an anonymous message to expose Brandon's crimes. It was a gamble, a desperate move to force Brandon's hand. But Dylan knew it was their best chance to keep the pressure on him while they gathered the evidence that could bring him down for good. "We need to do it now," Dylan said, his voice steady. "We have to send the message before they find us." Lisa hesitated, her face drawn with concern. "What if it's too risky? What if they intercept it?" "There's no time for second-guessing," Dylan replied, his eyes locking with hers. "We have to take the risk." Lisa looked at Edward, who nodded slowly, a grim determination in his gaze. "It's the only way," he agreed. We need to expose him, force him into a corner. Lisa didn't need any more convincing. She quickly grabbed her phone and handed it to Dylan. Record the message, she instructed. Make sure it's clear. Make sure it counts. Dylan nodded and walked to the corner of the room. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. The weight of the moment settled on him like a stone. He didn't have much to say, but he knew the message needed to be brief and powerful. His voice had to carry the truth, the undeniable proof of Brandon's betrayal. With the phone in hand, Dylan began speaking into it, his words coming out in a rush. This is Dylan Adams. I'm here to expose Brandon Sterling for the crimes he's committed. He embezzled millions of dollars from Edward Sterling, my family's friend and a respected philanthropist. He tried to kill him to cover up his tracks. This message is a warning. Brandon, the truth will come out. You can't hide anymore. Dylan paused for a moment, his chest tight, before adding one final sentence: you're going to pay for what you did. He hit the send button and watched as the message was transmitted. A small but crucial step in their fight for justice. But just as Dylan lowered the phone, a loud crash interrupted the quiet. The front door slammed open, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots pounding on the hardwood floors. They're in, Dylan muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. Lisa's eyes widened with panic. We have to go. Now. She grabbed Edward's arm, and they rushed to the back of the house, away from the men who had already broken through the front. Dylan moved quickly to follow them. But as he turned the corner, he spotted them, two men, tall and menacing, standing in the hallway, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. One of the men, a burly figure with a scar across his cheek, noticed Dylan and took a step forward, his voice cold and commanding. Where is he? He growled. Dylan froze. His breath caught in his throat. There was nowhere to run. But he wasn't about to back down. Not now. He's not here, Dylan said, his voice steady, though his pulse raced. You'll never find him. The man's expression twisted with rage. But before he could respond, a loud bang echoed from the front yard, followed by the screeching tires of a car speeding away. Mark had arrived. Let's move, Lisa shouted, grabbing Dylan's arm. In that instant, everything shifted. They were no longer just hiding, they were fighting for survival, for truth, and for the future. The game had changed, and now it was time to face the consequences of their gamble. The chaos in the house reached its peak in a split second. The sound of the front door crashing open still ringing in their ears as Mark's car sped down the driveway. Dylan's heart hammered in his chest. His thoughts scrambled. He had never imagined it would come to this, facing down the men who were hunting them, all while trying to protect Edward and get the truth out. His mind kept replaying the moment when the intruders had stepped into the house, their cold eyes searching for Edward. And Dylan had been forced to stand his ground. But just as quickly as the tension had escalated, it began to subside. Mark's presence was a beacon of hope. His years of experience in the field had equipped him with the skills and calm under pressure that Lisa and Dylan so desperately needed in that moment. The men who had entered the house were not expecting a well-thought-out counterattack. And Mark wasted no time. He had used his connections, his tactical knowledge, and his sheer will to arrive at the right moment. The men who had stormed the house, clearly looking for Edward, weren't prepared for a defense. They had underestimated how much the Adams family had already prepared for their arrival. By the time they were forced out of the house, Dylan felt the rush of both relief and lingering tension. The danger hadn't passed, not by a long shot, but they had bought themselves a little time. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the house fell into an uneasy silence. Dylan sat on the couch, his hands trembling slightly, as Mark and Lisa spoke in hushed tones in the next room. Edward, still recovering, was doing his best to stay calm, but the fear of being pursued lingered in his eyes. It wasn't just about the threat to his life anymore, it was about the future. About finding a way to ensure that Brandon couldn't destroy everything they had worked for. I think it's time, Mark said, walking back into the room. His voice was low, but his gaze was firm. We go on the offensive. Edward. You've got to trust us on this. Edward nodded slowly, his face pale but resolute. The time had come to act. The evidence they had collected, the emails, the documents, the recordings, were all they needed to bring Brandon down. But the challenge now was getting it to the authorities in a way that wouldn't backfire. Brandon was dangerous, and his influence could still cause a lot of harm. We can't wait any longer, Edward said, his voice hoarse but full of resolve. We need to expose him now. We can't hide anymore. We need to make sure he's held accountable for what he's done. Mark's eyes softened, a trace of understanding passing between them. I'll take the evidence to the right people. The authorities will know exactly what's going on. Brandon's time is up. As Mark went to prepare, Lisa turned to Dylan, her face weary but grateful. You've been through so much, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You're not just my son. You've been brave, and you've shown more strength than I ever imagined. Dylan shrugged, not sure what to say. He had simply done what he felt was right. In the midst of the chaos, he had felt the weight of what was happening, but he had never wavered. Helping Edward, helping his mother, it wasn't about courage. He realized. It was about love. About the responsibility to protect the ones you care about. I just did what had to be done, Dylan said softly. I don't want to live in fear anymore. Lisa smiled faintly, a mixture of pride and sadness in her eyes. I know, sweetheart. I know. And I'm proud of you. You've made a difference. As the hours ticked by, the plan was set into motion. Mark took the evidence and, under the cover of night, made contact with the right authorities. Dylan and Lisa remained on edge, waiting for the outcome, wondering if the truth they had fought so hard to expose would finally reach the light. The next morning, the phone rang with a call from Mark. Dylan's heart raced as he picked up the receiver. It's done, Mark said simply. Brandon's been arrested. The evidence you helped gather. Dylan, it was the key. Dylan stood there for a moment, unable to process what he was hearing. After everything, after all the fear and uncertainty, it was finally over. Brandon Sterling, the man who had tried to destroy their lives, was behind bars. His empire of lies had crumbled. Lisa exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging with relief. She pulled Dylan into a tight hug. You did it, Dylan. You helped stop him. Tears welled up in Dylan's eyes, but he didn't let them fall. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. He had witnessed the darkness in people, the cruelty of betrayal, but he had also seen the strength that people could find when they were willing to stand up for what was right. As the days went on, life slowly began to return to normal. Edward, though still healing, was no longer in hiding. He had been exonerated, his name cleared, and the media hailed his bravery for surviving the attack. But more than that, Edward was finally free from the grip of the man who had tried to destroy him. Edward didn't forget what Lisa and Dylan had done for him. As a token of his gratitude, he arranged for Dylan to attend a prestigious school, one that had been on his wish list for years but had seemed out of reach. The scholarship was his reward for bravery and sacrifice. It was a new beginning for them all. Dylan was about to step into a new chapter of his life, one filled with hope and possibility, but the lessons he had learned about loyalty, justice, and the power of standing up for the truth would stay with him forever. As he walked through the gates of Jefferson Academy, ready to start his first day, Dylan felt a quiet pride swelling in his chest. He had faced darkness and come out the other side stronger. He had been a witness to a profound truth: sometimes the hardest battles were the ones fought within ourselves. And the greatest victories came from standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. As the dust settled and the storm of betrayal and danger finally subsided, each of the characters found themselves reflecting on the events that had unraveled their lives. The ordeal had changed them all in profound ways, teaching them lessons that would stay with them forever. Dylan stood by the window in his new school, looking out over the campus. It was his first day at Jefferson Academy, and although the campus was bustling with new students and new faces, his mind was elsewhere. He thought back to everything that had happened the night he had seen the man thrown from the bridge, the fear that had gripped his heart as the danger closed in, and the quiet moments of determination when he had taken matters into his own hands. He had learned something invaluable during this journey. Bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. He hadn't just faced physical threats, but had confronted his own doubts, his own insecurities, helping Edward, standing up to Brandon's men, and protecting his family had forced Dylan to grow up faster than most kids his age. But in that growth, he had discovered his inner strength. He now knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he was capable of overcoming them. Fear could never be allowed to paralyze him. He had learned to act with courage, and that courage had changed everything. Lisa watched as Dylan walked across the campus, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. Her son had grown, and so had she. Throughout the crisis, Lisa had felt the weight of a mother's protective instinct. Constantly worried for Dylan's safety, she had fought to keep him away from the darkness that had threatened to engulf them. But in the end, Lisa had learned that protecting someone didn't mean shielding them from every danger, it meant teaching them to face it. She realized now that the best way to protect Dylan wasn't to control every step he took, but to give him the tools to navigate the world on his own. True protection came from empowerment, from teaching him to be strong and resourceful, and to trust his instincts. Lisa knew that her job as a mother wasn't just about keeping him safe, it was about helping him become someone who could stand on his own, no matter what life threw his way. She also realized that sometimes, the hardest decisions were the ones that forced her to let go. She had wanted to keep Dylan out of the danger, but in letting him help, she had seen him rise to the occasion. He had proven that he was capable of far more than she had imagined, and for that, she would always be grateful. Edward Sterling sat in the comfort of his home, no longer hiding in the shadows. His empire had once been defined by wealth, power, and influence. But in the end, those things had meant nothing when betrayal struck from within. He had learned the hard way that money could not buy loyalty or trust. His son-in-law, Brandon, had shown him that. But in the aftermath of his near-death experience, Edward had come to understand something far deeper. The true value of human connection lay in honesty, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right. Edward had spent much of his life building his fortune, accumulating power. But after everything had fallen apart, he realized that the relationships he had taken for granted were what truly mattered. His survival was not just a testament to his wealth, but to the love and support of people who truly cared for him, like Lisa and Dylan. They had risked everything for him, and in doing so, had shown him the kind of loyalty he had longed for but had never fully understood until now. He knew now that his legacy would not be defined by the buildings he had built or the money he had accumulated. It would be defined by the relationships he had forged, the people he had helped, and the love he had shared. True wealth, he realized, was in the love and trust you cultivated, not the riches you amassed. Mark stood on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. As a retired detective, he had seen his fair share of danger, betrayal, and deceit. But this case had been different. It had been personal. He had seen how Lisa, his sister, had fought to protect Dylan, how Edward had clung to his hope of justice, and how Dylan had refused to back down, even when the odds seemed impossible. For Mark, the lesson was clear. Sometimes, the most important thing you can do is protect the people you love and help them find their own strength. He had been ready to step in and solve the problem. But what he had seen was how much Dylan, Lisa, and even Edward had grown through the ordeal. Mark had often been the protector, the one who fixed things. But he had learned that sometimes, It was better to step back and let others rise to the occasion. This experience had reminded him that while the world might be full of darkness, there was always a light, a way forward through the hardest of times. It wasn't always about fighting back against the shadows, it was about finding the courage to keep moving forward, even when the way was unclear. As time passed, Dylan settled into his new life, taking with him the lessons of the past. Lisa continued to nurse her patience, her heart full of pride for her son and the man she had become. Edward, free from the shadows of his former life, worked to rebuild, not just his wealth, but his purpose. And Mark, ever vigilant, knew that the world would always present challenges, but he would be ready to face them with the same quiet resolve he had shown during this ordeal. Each of them had emerged from the darkness, and though their paths would continue to diverge, they would carry the same lesson, that the hardest trials bring the greatest transformations. In the end, it wasn't the wealth, the power, or even the justice they had fought for that mattered most. It was the bond they shared, the strength they had discovered within themselves and each other, and the knowledge that no matter what life threw their way, they were never truly alone. And that, they all knew, was the greatest victory of all.